Dear delegates, welcome back to our concluding panel in this 19th IISS Manama dialogue, where we want to talk about the future Middle East. And it is a real pleasure to have here with me on the panel 4 of my IISS colleagues to lead us through a number of themes. We have on my far right side, Emil Hokayem, the Director for Regional Security at the IISS. We have Rim Momtaz, one of our consulting senior fellows. We've got Hassan Al-Hassan, one of the research fellows who focuses on Middle East politics. And we have John Rain, our senior advisor for geopolitical due diligence. We will have this panel in a slightly more conversational format. So we here on the stage will have a bit of a conversation around a few of the themes that are of importance to this Manama dialogue, and we will then, again, in the usual way, open it up for questions and comments from the floor. And I'm very pleased to see that people have made their way back in. So please do take the opportunity to engage with the team here on a number of the questions we want to discuss. And I want to start by asking my colleagues that, of course, the focus that we've had today, yesterday, on Friday on the Israel-Hamas war is obvious and is also required in many ways. But there's a question of what are we overlooking here in the region as we focus on that. Maybe we can have a quick round on those things. Hassan, can I start with you? What do you think we are missing?
Sure. Thank you very much, Bastian. And I'll focus my remarks on the Gulf perspective. How do the Arab Gulf states see this? What are the second-order implications for them coming out of the ongoing war? I mean, as we all know, they're not direct participants in this conflict. They're not directly involved or directly engaged. But obviously, this war has far-reaching consequences for them. I think the first point to note here is that this is highly disruptive to their shared prosperity agendas. So this was the broad framework under which both Saudi Arabia and the UAE attempted to engage Iran on the one hand and Israel on the other in a framework of shared interests, the old liberal interdependence idea that shared interests are conducive to peace. And so this was seen as a vital instrument of regional de-escalation, supporting Saudi Arabia's recalibration of its foreign policy and the UAE as well to serve their domestic development agenda. So initiatives like the India-Middle East European Economic Corridor, for example, broad geo-economic connectivity initiatives were all seen within this umbrella of the shared prosperity agenda. And obviously the October 7 war, or the war since October 7, has made this much more difficult to accomplish. Mm-hmm. The second point, I think, is that this reinforces perceptions of US deterrence failure in the region. According to the Institute for the Study of War, we've seen 81 attacks by pro-Iranian militias in Iraq against US bases in Iraq and Syria. And the US has responded only 3 times that we know of. And so I think this reinforces the notion that short of an all-out war, there isn't really a deterrence of Iran in the region. And this is obviously an issue of significant concern, not to mention the fact that we are, in effect, seeing a dry run of the Iranian playbook, the ability to mobilize multiple fronts, the Houthis' ability to involve themselves in this conflict, and lob missiles that reach all the way to Israeli territory. The final point I'll make is that the US, as far as broad public opinion, Arab public opinion is concerned, is now running purely on hard power. There is no soft power at the moment. And to the extent that I think public attitudes, Arab public attitudes towards the US are probably at an all-time low since the 2003 invasion of Iraq.
Hassan, thank you very much. Reem, what should we have talked about more?
Well, there's 2 things I'm struck by, and they're sort of what I look at. The first is, this is the southern flank of the EU and NATO, and yet EU and NATO have been quasi-absent from the conversation over the past two days. There seems to be almost no expectations of the EU, whether it's member states on their own or the EU as an organization, to play any kind of real role in the management of this war and then the repercussions afterwards, even though actually the security theater is very connected, and clearly this war will have repercussions for EU member states, especially those in the Eastern Mediterranean and on the Mediterranean shore. So that is one that I'm quite struck by, and hopefully there will be more questions about perhaps the divisions within the EU, but also what various countries in the EU are trying to do. Same goes for NATO. And I would say just one other thing that I've been struck by, given the normalization that the Arab countries had tried to do last year with Syria. We didn't talk about the fact that Syria has become definitely a narco state, and the Captagon trails, let's say, have continued since that attempted normalization, and they are actually getting to Europe. So again, the connection between the southern flank and European security, very striking. I know that there is an increasing security concern in Europe about that trail of drugs getting into Europe, and we haven't been able to discuss that.
Thank you very much. Emil, what kind of, there are multiple conflict drivers obviously at play. Syria has just been mentioned. Emil, what would you focus on?
Let me start by making a broader point. Essentially, the previous decade has seen multiple conflicts in the region, and they've all generated fatigue, frustration. So the international response has been to try to, extent possible, freeze those conflicts in the hope that over time the drivers of violence, of competition will diffuse, and that somehow the various parties will see political settlements as the better way forward. We've seen that in Libya, Syria, Yemen, Israel, Palestine. But what we've also seen in the past 2 years, and just getting out of region, is that those frozen conflicts have a tendency to explode in our faces, because what happens is that when they're frozen, there's complacency. The attention moves elsewhere. And over time, those drivers of violence get supercharged, actually. So look at Ukraine, 2022, Nagorno-Karabakh, and now Israel-Palestine. At the moment, the theater I'm quite concerned about is northern Syria, as we see massive violence in Gaza because Israeli bombing, Hamas's attacks, and so on. The violence in northwest Syria is picking up. With increased Syrian regime and Russian bombings of Idlib in particular, a large number of casualties, real concerns about renewed displacement. We're talking about the size of Gaza, if not more, in that space. It is not as small as Gaza, but not too. In terms of density, it's not far from that. So this is a possible conflict zone that can actually erupt again and pose real challenges to the neighborhood. In northeastern Syria, you have another dynamic at play that is essentially fueled by questions about the future US presence. A number of quarters, people look at the current crisis of Gaza and the number of attacks that against US bases and targets that Hassan just referenced. And there are concerns that Washington, in a few months, having seen how costly and difficult it is to do force protection, will decide to essentially exit Syria and Iraq. In turn, this would fuel regional competition, whether it's Turkey or Iran or Russia in that space. They're all looking to fill those possible vacuums. And we see a number of actors positioning themselves for that day after. We talk a lot about the day after in Gaza. There is a day after in terms of regional politics to keep into consideration. So thank you.
Emil, thank you very much. John, what are some of the actors that you thought we might talk about more, but didn't perhaps?
Thank you, Bastian. I think there are 3 states in the region who are at interesting points in their lives, in their life cycle as states. And prior to October 7th, many people were talking about them, but we've changed the nature of the conversation about them. I think we should try to recover what we were saying beforehand. The 3 states are, first of all, Iran. And Iran is reaching the end of a revolution, both in terms of the age of its leaders and in terms of its ability to hand on the revolution to the next generation. This is the end of a political cycle. It would be premature to say that the end is imminent. We have said that many times with the Iranian regime. But it can't be doubted, and isn't doubted by the leaders themselves, that the next stage of the Iranian revolution is unclear and maybe its final stage. So there was a big question in my mind what the Middle East looks like as the Iranian revolution reaches the end of its natural life. That was the first state. The second state was Israel itself. And we have, of course, rightly devoted a lot of time to talking about Israel because of Gaza. But before October the 7th, Israel was having what can only be described as a midlife crisis. There was a profound constitutional crisis playing out on the streets of Tel Aviv. That has not gone away, and it raised deep questions and anxieties amongst Israel's friends about what Israel would look like on the other side of this crisis. And the third state, this is a happier note, I think, is the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. 2030 is not far away if Saudi Arabia achieves all the goals that it set itself in its transformation program and, as looks likely, steps out even further onto the world stage. What does that mean, both for the kingdom itself and for the region and its partners? We could have, in Saudi Arabia, a very influential, unique middle power. That will bring challenges as well as opportunities for the kingdom and its allies. So those three states, I think, worth considering as they go through sensitive, critical phases in their life cycle.
Thank you, John. Let's linger for a minute on that point you made about Israel. Can I ask you, what do you think are realistic goals for Israel in this war? Maybe if you can say a word about the resilience of Hamas as well. Do you have thoughts on this?
This is very difficult to predict the course of a conflict which is fueled still largely by emotion. But I think it is reasonable to assume that the Israeli military have defined operational goals, which, when they have achieved them, will allow them to moderate to a different and more, let us hope, a more moderate military posture with lower casualties. I think that's the first thing. There will be a natural cycle to the military campaign. The second thing, I use the word campaign because I sense that the Israeli security establishment is going to mount a campaign against Hamas, not simply a military operation. And the tail of that could be very long indeed. When one thinks about how the Israeli security establishment has pursued terrorist targets before, it has, as the US have and the US its allies have, it's played it long. So it could have a long tail. Mm-hmm. I think that point of modulation in the military campaign is also obviously an opportunity both for humanitarian relief, for negotiation, and of course for, one would hope, release of hostages. They're still alive.
Mm-hmm. Emil, you mentioned the term day after. What does Gaza look like on the day after?
Well, if you do a linear analysis and projection, there won't be much in Gaza the day after. While it's important to have that discussion about the day after, it should not be a distraction from the here and now, because it's what happens here and now that will determine whether there is anything viable in Gaza in the weeks and months to come. So while I suspect that there's a lot of well-intentioned planners in Western capitals who want to figure out what the setup should be, I think there's also the danger that just talking about some idealistic frameworks is going to divert from the more important discussion at the moment about how to get to a ceasefire. We heard a number of ideas. the past 2 days. It is probably the most vexing problem for many people around. But it really shows that we're still struggling, I think, both analytically and in policy terms about Palestine. The idea, for instance, that Gaza and the West Bank are fundamentally different entities is quite popular. I would argue that this is a misconception, that the links between the two are much stronger at every level. And so the idea that you can create a setup in Gaza that has no impact on the dynamics of the West Bank, I think is a dangerous one. Importantly, the idea about the day after is premised on the idea that you were going to have a regional consensus, that there will be regional muscle, regional assistance and funding. And I sat in the room the past 2 days, and I have not seen a regional consensus or a desire to jump into that space. If that assumption proves wrong, there's nothing standing. I mean, the likeliest scenario at that moment is that the day after is an Israeli occupation that withdraws the geography of Gaza, that displaces residents, and that importantly weakens the UN infrastructure that has kept Gaza viable. I mean, in still very difficult circumstances in the past few years. There is no, I mean, among analysts, but also among Arab observers of all that, we don't see anything really emerging. I mean, obviously, just saying that it's difficult is not a reason to say we shouldn't try, we shouldn't float ideas, but the thinking should also consider what the negative repercussions would be. Thank you.
Emil, thank you very much. Hassan, I want to come back to you. Emil has just mentioned the regional consensus and does it exist or not. And there are two elements to the question I want to ask you. On the one hand, do you think that the relationship that Israel has with the Gulf states actually restrains Israel in this context now? And then the second part would be what kind of support you think the Gulf nations could lend to Jordan and Egypt in this context? Hassan.
Well, thank you. I don't think really that the Gulf states stand much of a chance of restraining Israel directly. If we look at the trajectory of the Abraham Accords and how those have played out within Israeli politics, I think the effect has probably been in the other direction. We've heard Emirati Ambassador Youssef Ateba addressing a policy audience in Washington, D.C., saying very clearly that the Abraham Accords have not restrained Israeli expansion of settlements. And if anything, we've actually seen Benjamin Netanyahu point to those accords as evidence that Israeli-Arab normalization can proceed despite the lack of progress on a two-state solution. And so that's an unintended consequence of the Abraham Accords, but it's the way that the extreme right-wing government may have instrumentalized, I think, that agreement within domestic Israeli politics. The Gulf states don't have sufficient leverage over Israel that they're able to use. They, I don't think, are willing to engage in coercive diplomacy at the moment vis-a-vis Israel. The question is actually whether the Gulf states are able to shape the US position and to push the US to do more by way of applying pressure on Israel to change the course and to change its conduct of the war. And the question is there a political appetite in the Gulf to do so? The issue from the Gulf states' perspective is that they are torn in opposite directions by domestic public opinion and regional opinion on this issue. Versus their own geostrategic interests, which lie mostly in deterring and containing Iran, building a regional coalition against Iran. And so in that sense, in an environment of a heightened threat perception, because of the risk of a regional spillover, because of the way the Houthis have involved themselves, because of the way that Iran is able to mobilize multiple fronts, it's not entirely clear that the Gulf states want necessarily to put their own relationship with the US in the current environment under strain, despite, and we'll see how this plays out, the significant and considerable public pressure from within all of the Gulf states, within all of the Arab countries, that no one can afford to ignore, to take a stronger stance on and in support of the Palestinian issue. Can you remind me what the second component was?
Gulf support for Egypt, Jordan.
Gulf support for Egypt, Jordan. So we've recently published a paper on Gulf bailout diplomacy that John had also referenced earlier. I think we have to keep in mind that the Gulf states have supported Egypt and Jordan financially over multiple decades. Egypt was the largest recipient of Gulf aid over a 6-7 decade period, tens of billions of dollars in bailout assistance. Jordan, a smaller but nonetheless significant amount. The Arab states, including the Gulf states, have all coalesced around support for Egypt's and Jordan's total rejection of a mass expulsion, forced displacement of Palestinians outside of Gaza and the West Bank, because this is an existential national security issue for Jordan and a serious threat for Cairo as well. So we've seen a lot of Arab support for the Egyptian and Jordanian positions. I would suspect that the Jordanians and Egyptians would like to see even greater Gulf support, but as I said, the Gulf states have to balance a number of geostrategic considerations that also inform and also weigh on their positions as far as this conflict is concerned.
Thank you. You mentioned in your opening remarks, you mentioned that while the EU and NATO were both obviously represented here and actually spoke from this stage, they weren't really thought of in terms of the key actors in moving forward. So again, 2 points to you as well. What do you think the status of the strategic currency of those actors is in the region now? And then I also wanted to ask you, what do you think explains that sense of shock and surprise in many of these capitals, in Europe in particular, but elsewhere as well? But let's focus perhaps on Europe for a minute, around the events of 7 October. What are your thoughts?
Yeah. I mean, the strategic currency, I'll talk about the EU first. Clearly, right now, the offer of a geopolitical EU is in deep trouble. It's not just in deep trouble because it's unable to be an effective actor on this Israel-Palestine issue, but of course because the Russia-Ukraine front is not going very well for Ukraine, and there are massive questions that they need to handle over the next year ahead of the NATO Washington summit in DC, with big fears about what the US administration is going to be willing to continue doing in Ukraine, and the lack of ability by the EU states to take over completely for the US role if the US decides to sort of lower its involvement in Ukraine. On Israel-Palestine, within the EU, there are deep divisions on, first of all, the political positions toward Israel and Palestine and that issue, and then on a path forward. You have a small group of like-minded countries like Ireland, like Belgium, France sometimes is in that group, that is more on the side, let's say, of, I'm really simplifying here, but on the side of a more pro-Palestinian position. And then you have countries like Austria or Germany that are very staunchly in an almost no-holds-barred support of Israel. So it's very difficult for them to agree on what to do. And at the beginning of this round of the conflict, we saw, for example, completely shambolic communication from the EU, where you had the EU, one of the EU commissioners, in charge of EU humanitarian aid for Gaza, announce without actual debate or consultation with the member states that the EU was suspending humanitarian aid to Gaza, which immediately was rebuked publicly by European members of parliament and also by ministers of member states. You also hear from EU leaders and EU representatives that the EU's role has been very important in, for example, delivering messages, whether it is between the US and Iran on the deterrence component. But what is lacking in the EU position, of course, is the hardware to back up that deterrence message. So without the EU hardware that was immediately deployed, and actually that surprised people in the region, given the US posture over the past 15 years, without that, whatever channels of communication the EU member states or the EU as such can have with Iran is not going to be credible. And that is a hard fact that EU member states and the EU have to face. When it comes to NATO, NATO is in a slightly better position because the expectations are different. NATO, since the last summit, has revitalized its southern neighborhood initiative and is actively looking at ways to make it more effective. It is not expected to play a lead role on the Israel-Palestine issue directly, so they kind of get a bit of a pass. And when it comes to why has there been such a shock related to this war, I have to say I don't have a direct answer, even among Arab populations. Why has this war touched such a chord? You can see how affected people have been, whether it's on social media or when you speak to them. One thing that has come up in many of my conversations is that there is a feeling, a perception, whether that is rooted in reality or not is up for debate, but there is absolutely a perception and a feeling that with the Israel-Gaza situation happening at the same time and in parallel with the Ukraine-Russia war, that the double standard has been very blatant. You hear Arabs, whether, by the way, they're in Europe or in the Arab world, jokingly but angrily say, what is the going rate today for one Palestinian life compared to an Israeli life? And today the going rate is set to be 1 to 10. So 1 Israeli life for 10 Palestinians. And they compare that with the general outrage that took hold in Western countries when it came to the Russian invasion of Ukraine and how every single Ukrainian life matters. They've brought up, obviously, the US. I've heard this comparison multiple times, which, particularly with the NSC coordinator for strategic messaging, John Kirby, who was very virulent in defense of Ukrainian lives, but has said repeatedly at the podium in the White House that there are no red lines for Israel. So that has struck a chord with populations in Europe, and not just populations of, Arab or Muslim background, but on the left as well, and of course in populations here.
Maybe you want to come in on this one as well?
Yeah, I mean, it's undeniable that the Palestinian cause has immense sympathy in the region. And, listening to, some of the conversations here, my broader engagement, I think Western officials still underestimate the amount of rage there is. What we've seen in the past months in Gaza is enough footage to make two generations of Arabs quite angry. But at the same time, let me address the issue of double standards, and I think it's important to put in mind. And I'm sorry if it's going to sound flippant. It's not meant at all this way. But there was an actual genocide of Yazidis in Iraq a decade ago. There wasn't much a popular reaction to that. President Assad of Syria was brought back in the Arab League, and he was present at the Riyadh summit and elsewhere. If you look at the extent of devastation there, human and other, quite significant, also no real popular or even elite reaction to that. As we speak right now, Darfur, which was the site of large-scale genocide in the previous 20 years ago, is again facing the prospect of large-scale killing. So, just as Westerners may legitimately be blamed for having double standards, the Arab world itself has to face those same accusations. I mean, the list is long. I've just provided 3 examples here. What I'm trying to say is that, first and foremost, it is a policy challenge. It is a policy challenge. You can't compare all these situations. They're quite different in terms of, framework, geopolitics, history, and so on. This is certainly not a call to put Palestine on the side. To the contrary, if anything, for many reasons, I care a lot about the outcome there. I'm sorry that I had to use the I. But the point is that it does have a ripple effect. It is going to poison, it is going to shape relations between a number of Arab countries and their traditional Western counterparts. It will dominate every discussion within Arab forums and so on. So there's it's not just the right thing to move quickly on that. It's also the smart thing, because the longer this thing lasts, the worse the ripple effects will be. It's saddening at one point that other conflicts don't get the same attention. There are reasons, there are sometimes domestic conflicts, so there's less urgency, and they're not necessarily linked to the history of the formation of the modern Middle East. But the idea, just to be more precise, yesterday, for instance, we heard that the surge in humanitarian assistance is linked to a hostage release. And important, I think the point about hostages was important. I think Arab officials have not faced front and center the importance of releasing hostages, Israeli hostages. However, suggesting there is a conditionality between the two rather than concomitance is very troubling and has been perceived as such by a number of people. So we have to be very aware of the words used to describe this conflict or to explain policy responses. Thank you.
John, you look like you want to come in as well.
Thanks, Bastian. And you kindly invited us to mention things that we hadn't talked about. We're back talking, as we probably rightly should be, about Gaza and the Palestinian issue. And I think I might be the oldest person on this panel by quite a margin. So for my generation, who's seen so many attempts to solve the problem play out, I'd just offer a few observations on our conversations in this room on Gaza and Palestine. The first is that the process matters more than the result. And we can't leap from here to the result. But we must have a process. And a process is often enough to stop the fighting. And one, of course, thinks of previous processes which have done that. Secondly, to start the process requires a courageous and possibly eccentric move. And the gradualist approach, which has been advocated by many, and one can understand, we're in the midst of a conflict, one doesn't want to exacerbate the conflict, but it may not be enough. And of course, one thinks about dramatic moves that have been made, not least by late President Sadat, to leap across what appears to be an unbridgeable divide. And the third thing is the courageous move has to have a courageous leader. And one of the things that I entirely agree with my colleagues on is that in this case, the leadership is available in the region. The leadership may not be available for all sorts of reasons outside of the region, but it is available. And my last point on that is the trap of inherited vocabulary. And the two-state solution, whilst earnestly desired, it may be a phrase that's quite simply negotiating terms outlived its usefulness. I wouldn't presume to suggest something alternative, but states are also nations. You could have two nations. Many other people will have other suggestions how we do it. But I think being loyal to previous vocabulary can be confused with being consistent in your principles. It doesn't necessarily mean the same thing.
John, thank you very much. We're nearly 40 minutes in, and I've got a good 10 people on the list already. So I'll start taking some interventions from the room, and then we'll get back to them. And the first person I would like to ask is Florence Parly from France. Your microphone is live.
Thank you very much, and thank you for these highly valuable comments. My question is not a simple one. What are your views as analysts on what should be done to make the two-state solution happen? What would be the key conditions, and what would be the first milestones? Thank you.
Florence, thank you very much indeed. I'll give people a minute to think about that, so we'll have a few more interventions before we get back to answers. Khalifa Al-Suwaidi from the UAE.
I have a question for Reem. regarding the EU's vision for strategic autonomy. Is it dead amid this perception of declining support for the EU from the US, owing to its increasingly polarizing political scene? Thank you.
Thank you very much. And from Turkey, Hassan Ulusoy.
Well, thank you, Chair. Well, this is the first time I'm attending this prestigious forum. Thank you for the invite, actually. It's been fascinating. I have one brief observation and a following question. Over the 3 days, we have heard several interesting perspectives, and the main focus rightly was on of course, the Gaza and beyond. And among these interesting perspectives comes to my mind is the importance of the rules-based global order. Yes, it is a divine goal, but how can we do that? That is the question, I guess. And here, I might say, there is a conundrum, even there is an ontological question. Whose rules? Who will set the rules? Whose rule will be imposed? So giving all these predicaments, actually, in the international relations. Yes, the UN is our common house for such codifications, but we know previously in 2005 there was World Summit and there was an outcome document, but then nothing much happened. So giving all these predicaments facing the UN system, institutional settings. So I would like to really know and hear the comments, the views of our experts about what can be done to contribute such a rule-based global order in the face of all these ongoing hot conflicts and the suffering and atrocities. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'll take a few more and then we'll return to the panel and then we'll probably fit in another round. Laith Al-Ayuni from Jordan.
Thank you. I have a question for Reem. You mentioned Europe's Arab and Muslim communities' sympathy with the Palestinians, and we saw all of these demonstrations supporting the Palestinians. This raises multiple questions. What does that say about migrant integration efforts in the EU? Also, what does this mean for the future of Europe's social cohesion? And what does it say about the future of Europe's demographic and social identity?
Thank you very much. We'll take 3 more. From Qatar, Naif Al-Mullah.
Thank you. I have a general and a more specific question about the national visions for GCC member states and the future. Considering the ambitious national visions, which focus on economic diversification, human capital development, and technological advancement, what do you see as the key challenges and opportunities these states face in achieving these goals? Can you suggest how the success or failure of these strategies could affect the broader geopolitical and economic landscape of the Middle East in the next decade? And second, considering the escalating effects of climate change, how do you envision these states balancing economic ambitions with environmental sustainability, and what role could they play in regional and global efforts to address climate challenges? Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'll take from Lebanon, Laura Maisa Farjala.
Yeah, thank you. I have a question. You mentioned Iran, and Iran has achieved a lot already in this conflict. They forced a pause in the normalization process. They forced the Arab states, so to say, to take a neutral stand in between their partner in the US and Iran as the champion of the Palestinian cause. I'm wondering now, what is your sense of what is the end goals of Iran already? What does it want to still achieve, or what does it want to secure in this context?
Thank you very much. And last one in this round, John Chipman.
Thank you very much. I just wanted to take up the implicit point that John Rain made about the requirement perhaps for a bit of diplomatic shock therapy and I will propose a half-baked idea. I was a little bit worried when I heard on Saturday morning my very good friend and loyal attendant to the Manama Dialogue, Deputy Prime Minister of Jordan, say that what was happening in Gaza was Israel's mess. No one else was going to clear it up for them. It was for Israel to own it and solve that mess. The problem with that attitude of mind is that if you invite a Netanyahu solution to a problem, you will get a Netanyahu solution. And so I wonder whether really the relevant Arab powers can disenfranchise themselves from a central and primary role in addressing this. When in Europe we had the Yugoslav crisis and NATO, the EU, the UN, these large institutions were incapable of focusing on Milosevic's approach to Kosovo, a contact group was formed. And that contact group had relationships with the larger international institutions and also the key powers. A contact group for this crisis would logically be composed of 5 countries. The Kingdom of Saudi Arabia as the custodian of the 2 holy mosques and as the initiator of the 2002 Arab Initiative. The United Arab Emirates as the country that was first in the train on the Abraham Accords. Qatar that has a special relationship with Hamas. Egypt that has a particular relationship with Gaza, and the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan that has a special relationship to the West Bank. And cannot these 5 countries, perhaps led by Saudi Arabia, look to draw on the Palestinian Authority second generation, which even Mahmoud Abbas wants now to succeed in office, and find individuals in Gaza that have perhaps only a remote relationship to Hamas, and create a sort of embryonic idea of what an administration post-war in Gaza might begin to look like in order to show that the end of the war would still mean the possibility of a Palestinian administration that would lead into a state-like solution. But I worry that if the attitude of mind is, this is awful because over the last 75 years the Americans and the Europeans haven't been able to impose a 2-state solution, and there's a reliance on the Americans or Western Europeans to take up the diplomatic cudgel, that we'll still be having this debate in 5 years' time.
John, thank you very much. And that is one of the answers to Florence's initial question, the proposal that John has just made for that contact group to maybe take on that challenge in the way that John has described. Just to let everybody know, I've got about another dozen people. After all of these questions, we have another dozen people who want to come in at this point, and there might well be more in a few minutes. So please do engage with these questions, but do be crisp if you can. Rima, I'm going to start with you. You had a few things pointed directly in your direction, ranging from strategic autonomy to the societal cohesion in Europe. If you want to pick your way through a few of these.
Yeah, easy, simple questions. I'll start with strategic autonomy. Listen, I think people who say that strategic autonomy is dead are basically saying that Europe should not exist. I mean, at one point, countries have to take over their own fate, right? That is what strategic autonomy is at the very heart of it. You can call it whatever you want. You can call it sovereignty, you can call it autonomy, you can call it banding together, whatever you want to call it. At one point, these strong, rich countries that were, benefited from, obviously, the U.S. giving them the security guarantee that they needed to rebuild themselves. They benefited from the post-World War II order that was dominated by the U.S. to become as rich and as influential as they are. It is normal that right now, at this point in time, they should be able to stand on their own 2 feet. The problem with all of the ways that strategic autonomy has been discussed so far is that not one country in Europe has actually done, over the past 10 or even 5 years, the investments in its own industry in order to be able to turn that into more than just theory or a slogan. And that is what the Ukraine war has revealed in a way that has been quite crude. If the US hadn't existed, I have strong doubts on whether Ukraine would have been able to repel the initial assault by Russia, because it was the US that was able to send the weapons in the mass that was required and to maintain that flow of weapons while big countries like Germany or France were not in a position to do that. Their industries are still not in a position to do that. So that question is not going to go away, and the US turn away from the European security order is only going to get worse. And it's not a question of just Trump. I keep saying this. This is not a Trump issue. You know, the Obama administration was talking in these terms in ways that were more diplomatic, but that was the bottom line for them. And so that is something that European leaders need to integrate. It doesn't mean that the US will disappear from their security order, but it means that as Europeans, they need to do much more, and perhaps the lion's share. When it comes to, I say, social cohesion in Europe and its migrant population, you know, there are various models of integration of immigrants in Europe. There isn't one monolith. What France does is not the same as what Germany does. It's not the same as Hungary. You know, that is a big open question. It is clear that we are in a moment of crisis on this issue. You have a real rise of far right in a way that isn't just in the far right. It is becoming more and more mainstream. There is backlash against visibly different minorities in Europe. There is a backlash for a return to a very let's say, purist view of what being European is. And that is a conversation that Europeans need to have amongst themselves. It is difficult. And it does come with security risks. You can see today with the Israel-Palestine issue that a lot of countries are very worried about a resurgence of terrorist attacks within their own countries. That is something that they're dealing with every single day, whether it's the rise of anti-Semitic attacks, which have happened, or whether it is worrying about a resurgence of ISIS-style attacks that benefit and weaponize the feelings of disenfranchisement that some of these populations are feeling in Europe. Just a quick answer to Florence, what should be done for the two-state solution. You know, as John was saying, it's the time for some pretty tough and creative solutions, and that's where I think Europe and the US need to be weighing in the most. The settlements in the West Bank can't continue existing the way they are. It's just not possible. Palestine cannot be the only country in the world that doesn't have territorial continuity and that is like a Gruyere cheese, you know, pockmarked by settlers who, by the way, are also messianic in their approach to their existence. And Gaza can't remain that disconnected from the West Bank. So there has to be some sort of territorial swaps that happen that don't happen at the expense of the Palestinians. And on the other side, the Arabs perhaps need to tell the Palestinians that maybe a big part of the refugees that have been abroad since 48 and 67 perhaps won't be able, all of them, to come back to whatever Palestinian state emerges. And I'll leave it there.
Thank you very much. Just for completeness' sake, I would just want to briefly underline, I think that the UK also played quite a useful role in blunting the early Russian assault, both through training and also delivery of things, just as a footnote. Hassan, can I turn to you next, and maybe you can pick up the specific questions that were asked about the vision documents and how all of that interacts. Hassan.
So I'll address those, but before I do that, I'll just make a point or two on the Gaza basket of issues. There was a question on international law and the rules-based order, and how do we uphold the rules-based order? Yeah. I think the consistent application of international law is a necessary but insufficient requirement for the continued survival of the rules-based order. And that's very important, and all the more important in the context of the current war in Gaza. The US is the system leader, and what the US does and says on this issue matters tremendously. This takes me to my second point about what makes the Palestinian issue so special. Emil mentioned a host of other cases that involve tremendous amounts of suffering and so on. I think there are two things that make the Palestinian issue special. The first, as I said, is that Israel's ongoing military campaign, atrocious military campaign, is US sanctioned. This is a fundamental distinction that separates this from other conflicts and cases where this was not happening with the approval of states that are significant in the international system like the US. This is a very important qualitative difference that I think explains a lot of the frustration and outrage that we see surrounding this case. As Reem mentioned, we've clearly heard from the US that there are no red lines on Israel as far as this is concerned. So this is a qualitative distinction. The second qualitative distinction is that this is happening, as we've already heard, in the context of an occupation. This is a somewhat exceptional situation in the world, and an occupation in addition to a settler, colonialist, segregationist context. So these are, I think, qualitative differences that make the Palestinian issue particularly special and that elicit a stronger response by comparison to other conflicts. The third point to make, going to John Chipman's question, I think the Arab states see a risk in talking about the day after and trying to propose post-conflict roadmaps and post-conflict reconstruction, of sending a signal that by talking about post-conflict reconstruction, you enable Israeli destruction today. And the question is that, what can the Arab states possibly do now to shift Israel's conduct and prosecution of the war today, to change Israel's goals in this military campaign today? And I think the answer is probably not much. But I think they are still cognizant of the risk that by talking about the day after in some fantasy land scenario, that they will essentially be providing Israel with political cover to say, we'll pick up the pieces. And I think this is my interpretation of Minister Safadi's comments. Finally, on the question of Gulf visions, there are a host of challenges. I think the climate and the economic aspects of Gulf visions are highly interconnected through the energy transition and the perceived need of the Gulf states to remain as reliable energy suppliers while also keeping up with the energy transition. The main factor that I would like to focus on is the geopolitical risk factor, and this is very significant for the Gulf states because the Gulf states are import dependent. They don't produce a lot of innovation. They rely on their financial capital to import knowledge and technology. And the fact that we now see greater protectionism, greater nationalism when it comes to the sharing of technology, we see the reintroduction of trade barriers, we see the introduction of protectionism in the US that affects Gulf exports of steel and aluminum, despite WTO rulings that these tariffs are illegal. This obviously is a major geopolitical risk factor for the success of for the delivery on economic modernization ambitions and agendas on the part of the Gulf states. They rely on connectivity, they rely on the seamless exchange of technology and knowledge to be able to modernize their economies, and without that, due to the geopolitical risk, they face a higher bar of challenge in their attempt to do that.
Hassan, thank you very much. Emil.
Yeah, just first to address, John Rain asked us to think boldly. Florence Parly had a more focused question. John Shipman provided one idea about the contact group. You talked about settlements. Let me add my point on this one. If the EU in particular wanted to take a stance, EU member states right now, those of them who haven't yet, could recognize the state of Palestine. Just as they affirm their strong support for Israel's security and importance that it live in a secure neighborhood, those countries that have resisted that move for a long time, saying we'll do that once the negotiations have happened. Well, this is perhaps a moment to do it. I hope it's discussed, because otherwise, all the protests right now, Josep Borrell was here explaining to us what the no's were and the yeses and so on. Well, this is a practical way of putting this in motion. Israel will get security guarantees. it's clear from statements and so on that there is strong support. Perhaps it's time to think about the other one. I want to address the issue of Iran, and I'm sure John Rain will add to that. But I see Iran as a net beneficiary of this crisis at the moment. Yes, it is a moment of risk for Iran. It does worry about how the escalation in the region is playing. But I think Iran in the past 2 years has had two good surprises, essentially. And the first one is the Ukraine war, which allowed Iran to say to Russia and China, hey, welcome to the club. We've been resisting Western imperialism for 4 decades, and you guys were, flirting with them, trying to, build geoeconomic connections. Russia was once interested in entering NATO, and China relied on trade with the US and others for its own prosperity and so on. But yeah, perhaps you had it wrong, and we in Tehran always, were clear-eyed about what the challenge was. So I think Iran does expect that there will be greater alignment between those 3 countries, possibly more, that this whole discussion about BRICS and the rise of the South and so on will eventually help Iran globally. Now, whether Iran will have access to the technology, the talent, the capital, the markets, and so on that many in Iran who look east have, still is doubtful. But this is enough fuel for Iran to feel good globally for the next few years. I would say also regionally, Iran has done quite well. I mean, that latest crisis in Gaza comes, in a way, at a good moment for Iran, because it has rebuilt relations with Saudi, with the UAE, with Egypt possibly, and others. And so, in a way, Iran feels successful. It has spooked its regional neighbors in the previous phase, the 2019 attack in Saudi, the attacks against the UAE, and so on, that put clearly on the table what the risks for countries opposed to Iran are. And then that crisis emerges, and it's not as if regional countries have said, okay, we're going to cut relations with Iran. No, if anything, we saw the first meeting between Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman of Saudi Arabia and Iranian President Ibrahim Raisi. I'm not saying there is necessarily much substance to this, but the regional countries want to sustain the appearance, perhaps the illusion, of de-escalation. And that's a net plus for Iran. And finally, Iran is back in the game as a, it can tell everyone else, we kept our eye on the ball all along. The Palestinian cause, while everyone else was, distracted or compromising with Israel or seeking big deals with the US and so on, we did not compromise. We were there. Now, on the downside, Iran faces real risk of escalation that it has avoided so far. I think the first one is what to do in Lebanon or with Hezbollah. I think Iran and Hezbollah are still very unwilling to jump into that fight. It's uncomfortable. They have to demonstrate to the Lebanese and others, why it was okay to, build up a militia, which turned into essentially conventional military in the past decades for the big one. And when this existential issue that is Gaza emerges, well, not much happens. But that's because Iran is very strategic, I think. At the end of the day, Iran looks at this war as still not the big one. It is not an existential challenge for the Iranian leadership. So why do you want to deploy your ultimate instrument of punishment and deterrence, that is Hezbollah? So they've decided not to do that. At the same time, however, they're pushing in a number of places. The power of their partners in Iraq is growing. The Houthis are consolidating in Yemen, feel emboldened, so they can fire missiles, cruise missiles, ballistic missiles, UAVs at Israel. I mean, and it's happening without Iran paying a direct price. So I see Iran as a net beneficiary of that phase.
Emil, thank you very much. John, do you want to add a few thoughts to that?
Yes, Iran has benefited in the ways that Emil says, but it's got a problem, and I come back to just remember where it is in the life cycle of a revolution. So it needs to preserve two things. It needs to preserve its credibility at home. It needs to preserve its assets overseas. And those those are the two reasons it hasn't entered this war. At home, you may remember that demonstrations against the Iranian regime include the chant, not for Palestine, not for Lebanon, but for Iran, we give our lives. So, foreign adventures are no more popular in Iran than they have been in the USA or in European countries. So its problem is that it needs to remain credible and potent at a time when it has many practical problems, not least the management of the economy, notwithstanding the windfall that it may have had, has deeper structural problems. It has a problem with an estranged younger generation, estranged if not hostile. And it's got a credibility issue in that if it has structured the state to the point where it actually has part of its armed forces named in honor of Jerusalem, if it structures the whole state around sponsoring courses which are about Palestine and the liberation of Jerusalem, and then in this crisis it hasn't done anything, then what are they there for? And that's something that will have been noticed, has been noticed inside Iran. So I think the Iranians don't come out of this necessarily in a stronger position. I think it just emphasizes some of the problems that this regime has got.
Thank you very much. Let's get a few more interventions in. We've still got a long list. I'll prioritize a few people who I haven't called on so far in this session or previous sessions. So first, please, Adrienne Mong from the US.
Hi, thank you. It's a general question. What is the role of China in the region? How is it viewed beyond its interactions in trade and energy investments? Is there a significance, if any, that it's the first stop for this delegation?
Thank you very much. From Germany, Ben Schreier. Hold on, I just need to find you. Here you go.
Well, thank you. Maybe a more tactical question, and coming back to the proxy, Iran's proxies. So has Hamas maybe miscalculated and overplayed its hands given the full-on Israeli response? And depending on what your answer is, what are the implications for the proxies of Iran? Will it make them more risk-averse or more escalatory? Thanks.
Thank you very much. Dr. Yicheng Lai, please.
Thank you. And I also have a question about China as well. My question basically is that how would this war affect the region's perception about Chinese standing in the Middle East? Especially earlier this year, we do see that China has a role in helping the resumption of the diplomatic relation between Iran and Saudi Arabia, and also China engineered the entrance of UAE, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and into the BRICS. And after this war, how would this influence and standing, would that be affected or not? Another question is that how would the Middle East perceive about Chinese possible economic role in the future? Especially this year, we started to see that the Chinese economic downturn that's become very real, and it could be the longer term and structural. How would the Gulf states, especially and also in the Middle East widely, look at the Chinese economic future? Would they still consider that China can provide a affirmative economic opportunity for the economic plan? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Ian Godden from the UK.
My question is very similar to the last one, so I'll just say a little bit of context. This event has rightly been caught up in the present. It's been excellent from that point of view. And we've had perspectives and comments from and about the US, NATO, European Union. In the long run, have we underestimated the shift to the east, which really brings back China, India, Russia into the context? Or is that so far away at this stage that it's a bit remote and maybe for another time?
Ian, thank you very much. Okay, we'll take a few more. I still haven't made it below 10 here on my list, so there's lots of appetite. So let's keep going for a little bit longer. Fatma Al-Arimi from Oman. I think you had one question answered now, so maybe maybe on a roll now.
My question is to Emil, is why did you describe the Arabs' take on Gaza war as part of a double standard where, to me, it seems consistent with the past experiences on how our countries deal with these conflicts? And I have a few examples from the past. One example is how Saddam Hussein, the former president of Iraq, treated Kurds in his country, and how did the other countries in the Arab region reacted to that, vis-a-vis how did they reacted when Iraq invaded Kuwait. The take is different. It all boils down to one following rule in how I see it. If it involves more than one country, it gets more attention and more coverage and more involvement from the region. The same thing happens not just in the Arab or the Middle East, but also internationally. When Scotland had a referendum to secede from the UK, you didn't have a lot of interaction or a lot of coverage. Yes, there were some columns and some think tanks discussing the impacts of that, but compared to Brexit, again, it was a significant importance to them. The same happens in the war. If there are any conflicts within Ukraine itself, had it been between the capital and Karabakh, compared to the Russian attacks on Ukraine. So it seems consistent to me, so that's why I wonder, why did you describe it as a double standard, where it seems to me, again, as a historical trend in how we deal with different conflicts. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'll take a few more. Also, Rawashte from Jordan.
Thank you very much. I want to ask about the role of Turkey. I think Turkey wasn't mentioned a lot in this conference, in this war and the future of the Middle East.
Thank you very much. That was very crisp. Abdesam Al-Ketbi from the UAE.
Thank you. I just want to put frame for the discussion. Where's Iran or the losers in what's going in the region? In the calculation of that normalization between Saudi and Israel, the Abraham Accord, all these things, and of course the Ukrainian war, Iran was watching, of course, that meeting between the Israeli and Saudi, and feel that they are losing, excluded from the Indian Middle East corridor. Also, they feel they are loser. The Russian and sanction against them in the Ukrainian war, they felt they are loser. The Chinese also, and that new corridor, and the American want to shift the attention to new corridor rather than Belt and Road. All those are loser if you don't calculate them. And Hamas, of course, the Saudi were meeting with PA and neglecting or ignoring them. Those are loser. Of course, they will retaliate. They will retaliate. And this Gaza war, if you took it only, it's between Hamas and Israel, you mislead yourself and others. It's beyond that. It's not domestic, it's not regional, it's international. And that's why when I ask McGurk, all this heavy military in the region, it's not about Hamas and Israel. So Iran doesn't want, of course, Emil, it's not about Hezbollah. Iran doesn't want, Hezbollah is more important than Hamas for Iran. Of course, they don't want put Hezbollah in this war because of that. But they cannot, of course, Hezbollah not attacking Israel, otherwise they will lose, okay? That they are not defending Al-Quds or the Iranian, but not direct war with Iran. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'll take a few more and then we'll have a final burst here from the panel. Can I get Lawrence Rubin, please?
Thank you so much. Actually, a couple of my esteemed colleagues have already asked very similar questions, but I'm going to drill down on it because it ties to a previous theme from last year about China's role. This has to do, but what I was curious, China's role in this, what and how the Middle East thinks about, and the Gulf too, of China's role after this, and more specifically, what outcomes might affect it. So that's why I want to add more specific to, can you think of a few outcomes that may affect the perceptions of China from this region?
Thank you very much. John Ellison.
Thank you. Realistically, how can people talk about the possibility of a two-state solution when you have 500,000 settlers who have no intention of moving and their number is ever increasing?
Thank you very much. I'll take three more, and then we'll return to the panel. I'll take Noah Bonsai, please.
Thanks. General question to the panel. Several of the speakers throughout the weekend have talked about the fact that while the specifics of the 7 October Hamas attacks were surprising, obviously the fact that, the likelihood, I should say, that the Israel-Palestine conflict would re-escalate in the short to mid-term was widely perceived prior to 7 October. Very little was done to avert that by the US in particular, by other actors. Emil, you noted that Syria, even prior to 7 October, the conflict seems more fragile than at any point since early 2020. If the Gaza war spreads, if the US precipitously leaves, that conflict will re-escalate in all likelihood. Maybe colleagues who work on Yemen would say something similar. Often we look to the US to take the lead on diplomacy. They've made pretty clear in this administration they aren't interested in doing that on these conflicts, at least not proactively. So what can be done to fill these diplomatic voids in order to ideally avert re-escalation of ongoing conflicts rather than try to struggle to contain the fires once they reignite? Thanks.
Thank you very much. Basima Halawi-Rowe.
Thank you. At the opening of Manama dialogue, His Royal Highness Prince Salman, he said, "You cannot change the reality without changing the narrative." Hassan, you talk about more than 81, we lost counting actually how many Iran proxy attack US bases in Iraq and Syria. As a Gulf expert from the Gulf perception, what change need to be done to the US narrative on deterring Iran? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Fabian Hinz.
Yeah, thank you so much for the highly interesting remarks. My question goes to Emil, and I would like to know your assessment of how the current crisis will affect the internal Lebanese situation. Right now, we're all very concerned about the possibility of further escalation with Hezbollah, but even if that would not happen, how would the current crisis affect the internal balance? Thanks so much.
Okay, let's see whether we can create a clean slate here. Tom Beckett.
Okay, maybe a somewhat esoteric question. Imran Safadi yesterday said that Hamas emerged from the occupation, and it's true, in the late 80s it did. It came from the Muslim Brotherhood. So I've got a question in three parts. Would Hassan al-Banna be proud of his progeny? Should Gazans want to be governed by the Ikhwan? And lastly, how many Arab governments want to see Hamas survive this war?
Thanks, Tom. Sam Dagger.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, my first question is just going back to what Hassan mentioned earlier about this balancing act that the Gulf countries have to strike. I'd like to zero in maybe a little bit on Saudi Arabia. How does that balancing act look like in terms of, you know, keeping the detente with Iran in place, but at the same time needing to ramp up the defense relationship with the United States in light of everything that's going on in the region? And then just maybe very briefly to Emil and John or whoever wants to weigh in. I mean, if the conflict continues, it escalates, Israel says it's not going to stop, it wants to eradicate Hamas. The US is saying Israel has the right to do so. What will the proxies do concretely? I mean, you talked about Syria, Iraq, Yemen. I mean, any thoughts on what could maybe concretely happen? Thank you.
Thank you very much. And the last question for James Hackett.
Bastian, thanks. Maybe just a quick one to John Raine and then a more general one. John, on Iran internally, it'd be good to get your sense, based on experience, of what we're more likely to see, increased turbulence or more overt centralization of the business IRGC theocracy nexus. And another long-standing issue that hasn't really been mentioned about the Kurds. The Kurds had a referendum on independence in 2017. I wonder if anyone on the panel would like to pick up the point of what's the likely trajectory for that part of the region. Thank you.
Wonderful, thank you very much. Okay, it's 12:48. I need 2 minutes at the end, so we've got 10 minutes for responses, which means that everybody roughly gets 2.5 minutes. Hassan, I'll start with you. I'll then go to John, then Emil, and Reem gets the last word. Hassan, maybe you can specifically address the China and the looking east related questions.
Absolutely. So I'll address those and the two specific questions that were addressed to me very quickly. So beginning with the two questions, I think I'm not paid enough to attempt to cure the ills of U.S. policy in the region. I don't think anyone is. But the point, I think, the basic issue from the perspective of the U.S.'s Gulf partners is massive U.S. policy volatility on Iran. It's probably the issue on which we've seen the greatest amount of U.S. policy volatility going from the Obama administration to the Trump administration to the Biden administration. Right? We saw the U.S. enter into a flawed JCPOA and then even make the bigger mistake of pulling out unilaterally from that flawed agreement. And so from the perspective of the Arab Gulf states, it's the extent of U.S. policy volatility on what is their core strategic issue of interest, which presents a massive policy challenge for them. So this goes to Sam's question. How do they address it? And how do they balance between those various imperatives? We've published a paper earlier this year called Mitigating the Risks of an Unconstrained Iranian Nuclear Program. We spoke to many policymakers in the region to try to understand exactly how they deal with that specific question. We found that, partly as a response to the massive US policy volatility, Gulf approaches towards Iran have matured and crystallized around a three-pronged approach of doing simultaneous containment, deterrence, and engagement of Iran. And so you try and contain and deter Iran by building regional partnerships, but you still try to offer a carrot through the shared prosperity in Jeddah and whatnot. Going to the China basket of questions, they're all interrelated. The relationship between the Gulf and China is multi-layered. The crux of that, the rock foundation of that is economic. It's trade and energy. So China is the largest trading partner. It's the largest energy market for almost all of the Gulf states. To illustrate an extreme example, Oman exports 90% of its oil to China alone. So it's a massive market. That's the bedrock. That's the foundation. The second layer is the investment layer, and that's the BRI. We have a few, and my colleague Mayan Owens and Kemi Lons and others have done fantastic work on this, looking at how China has used the digital Silk Road to build a partnership with Israel and the UAE, how China uses the Belt and Road Initiative to build a massive footprint in Iraq's energy and oil sector. And so the BRI has been an interesting framework for China to become an investment player in the region. The third layer is the political and diplomatic. So this goes to China's growing diplomatic engagement, facilitation of Iranian-Saudi de-escalation. We also saw China, as the president of the UN Security Council, play an important role, along with the UAE, to push forward this current conflict within the UN Security Council. But we see China playing opportunistically, trying to point out the faults of US diplomacy. And at the same time, we've seen the region use China as a hedge against the US and to get the US more interested and more involved. And finally, there is the military layer, which is an emerging area. There are obviously US intelligence concerns about a potential growth in China's military footprint in the region, as well as joint exercises between the UAE and China. So it's a multi-layered relationship. It's fundamental. It's not going anywhere. If anything, we tend to overestimate the turn east, actually, rather than underestimate it, because the Gulf states still, despite all of these multi-layered facets of the China-Gulf relationship, regional states still see and have a preference for the US as their security and military partner. Thank you.
Hassan, thank you. Excellent. John, what happens at the end of that life cycle?
I think we all know what happens at the end of the life cycle. Let's not get too gloomy. But on Iran, Ben, you're asking about Iran's proxies in the region. And there was another question, I think, about what's going to happen internally. More of the same, probably, on both. More of the same until it all stops. So what might stop it? First of all, on the proxies, I think we've got, there's a regional phenomenon of excluded power. There are, by my estimates, between 10, 15 million people in the region who live under some kind of non-sovereign power, non-state actor, could be a militia. That's a phenomenally high percentage of the population of the region. Whether that's amenable to a generic solution, I don't know. It may be best treated within separate issues, but it's a persistent problem, because if it isn't Iran who instrumentalizes these groups, it could be some other player. That's the first thing. There's a regional phenomenon to be dealt with. On Iran itself, internally, it's important to remember that the opposition, which is now quiet, is still present. So nothing was done either to reverse the growth in opposition to the regime or to satisfy any of its demands. Least of all, the grievances which were just a function of another generation being administered oppressively by another generation, which it doesn't understand. So the timeline on this is long, and it's very much in favor of the coming generation in Iran. So I think we are going to see more disturbances there, and inevitably we're going to see more oppressive measures from the Iranians. Somebody mentioned the Kurds. Who's going to do the Kurds?
Seamless handover.
Okay, before I get to the Kurds, let me just address the questions that were directly asked to me. So first, Fabian, about Lebanon. Your guess is as good as mine at this point. I think the extreme state of despair in Lebanon, the economic decline, the political, not paralysis, but vacuum at this point, the security instability, all this is piling up. This is no longer a functioning polity. There were times where, if we could get a president or if we get this cabinet, it was very tactical. I think at this point it's the state of disrepair is so advanced that very difficult to predict, which is why you see a lot of countries trying to just pull plugs here and there in this specific scenario. That you won't be able to fix anything in Lebanon as long as the regional situation is growing so much. Everyone has an interest in pushing specific interests. It doesn't amount to a collective approach. We've seen the French try and fail. We've seen the US disinterest. We saw Saudi disinterest. I think the only certain thing in Lebanon is that Hezbollah will continue making inroads because it still has access to more consistent financial assistance. It has the use of coercion, or the threat of. It has a strong narrative. It sees the other side or the other sides losing motivation, sense of moral of purpose, and so on. So quite bleak. I do have a magical solution, but I'll share this with you later. I was asked directly the question about, why did I question Arab approach on Gaza? And it sounds philosophical, but I think that we should drop the double standard approach. It's one thing to say inconsistent. It's fine. I think the double standard one assumes that there is, that all the contexts are somehow the same. That, say, let me challenge you back on this one. Look at the general Arab attitude towards Ukraine, for instance. Lots of hedging, not wanting to do that, where this is the most clear-cut case of an international violation, and everyone is dancing around. Sometimes we vote against or we abstain at the UN. Sometimes we make statements and so on. It's inconsistency. Sadly, it is present in international politics. Yes, it should be highlighted in the case of Gaza. I'm not trying to make the case that we shouldn't. But when we brandish the double standard argument, we somehow make it seem as if we're applying one standard in our politics within our immediate neighborhood, which is not the case. A couple of questions about proxies. Yeah, I'll make that point. I think proxies or partners of Iran see this as a moment of opportunity, not necessarily to jump into an all-out war against Iran itself, but it is about advancing their and consolidating their power in the geographies they already exist. it's much harder right now, whether it's in Iraq or Syria, or just mentioned Lebanon or Yemen, to push back. I think they see this, first, the big powers are distracted. Second, there's less appetite because people realize what the exposure is and so on. They think, again, they have the narrative on their side and so on. So, yes, it could go all blow up into a major war, and I'll have to, publicly apologize for having it gotten wrong. But I think the primary interest at the moment, the primary focus, is to consolidate where can be. The Kurds was asked. The Kurds are in a very difficult situation at the moment, and they've been for some time. They've been quite weakened in Iraq, for instance. In northeast Syria, they have to prepare for a new dispensation of power. Turkey has taken much stronger action against them, Iran as well. The Kurds are, they had, their 15 years where the environment was relatively benign or even positive for them. They had access to resources and so on. I think the situation is much more challenging. I promised that would be the last one. So
Good, thank you very much.
I'm going to answer in two sentences.
Concluding thoughts from you.
There was a question on, whether the EU, NATO, US underestimated the shift to the east, and what should they be doing instead of putting out fires. They did not underestimate the shift to the east. In fact, they've been kind of obsessed with the shift to the east, and you hear a lot when you're in Europe talk about what is the global south thinking, how are they looking at China. So this has been an obsession for at least a year and a half, 2 years, almost paralyzing in a way. And then the second thing on, what should they be doing, not putting out fires. I'm not reinventing the wheel here. They have to reinvest in deterrence, they have to reinvest in muscular diplomacy, and they have to reinvest in establishing and feeling comfortable with power dynamics. That is something I am saying especially about the European countries. Obviously, the US is very comfortable with that, but the Europeans need to get out of their kind of enchanted bubble and get back into the real world where most of us have been living while they've been kind of in a cocoon for 50 years, more or less, and I'll leave it there.
Wonderful, thank you very much, Reem. Excellent, that lands us exactly at 1 p.m. As we had hoped, and the fact that the room is still packed at 1 p.m. on Sunday, I think is a testament to three things. Your stamina, thank you very much. Second, the extraordinary times in which we, of course, convene, but I think I can say also because analytical excellence was on display from all of my colleagues. So thank you very much for making such a productive and high content and high protein session. Thank you very much. I just want to conclude briefly before everybody goes to their lunch and on their way. With three things. The first one is a round of thanks to the excellent and extraordinary efforts of the IISS team in pulling together this 19th IISS Manama Dialogue. Also all the hotel staff that have supported us and looked after us over the course of this weekend, and of course the many officials from the kingdom, from the government of the Kingdom of Bahrain, for making sure that we're all safe and sound and again looked after, and of course His Royal Highness the Crown Prince for his remarkable speech on Friday evening. I want to offer a few statistics. We had 568 full delegates here at the Manama Dialogue. A total of 3,265 badges were printed to support and run this dialogue. We had 56 nationalities participating, 51 government delegations and 18 full ministers participating in this dialogue. Over 100 members of the media and press covered this event. 8 broadcast networks attended, providing coverage. And on social media, IISS Manama Dialogue content has appeared on over 272 million times in various news feeds. We've reached a unique audience of over 75 million people. It's important, 60 million of which are in this region and 15 million worldwide. Final thing I want to say is a look ahead. The IISS never rests, so we will convene the Shangri-La Dialogue in Singapore at the end of May, early June, 31st of May to the 2nd of June, and we will see some of you there. We, as you know, we take care that there is a Gulf representation at the Shangri-La Dialogue and also an Asian representation, Indo-Pacific representation here at the Manama Dialogue, and we will continue to do that. Now, we conclude our 19th Manama Dialogue now. I think obviously the circumstances were extraordinary in which we convened. I think we had a very useful conversation about processes, about goals that need to be pursued. Ideas were put on the table, and I think we had a constructive, even at sometimes obviously lively debate that is appropriate, I think, under the circumstances. I want to say that next year we will convene here in the Kingdom of Bahrain for the 20th anniversary of the IISS Manama Dialogue. We are already thinking about how to make that a great success, and we're looking forward to working with you as we do that, and then see many of you here again. So thank you very much for all your contributions. Thank you for being here. Have a good rest of the day. Thank you.